All right, so the reason I picked the passage that we're about to get into comes from the fact that recently we have been engaged in a study on Wednesdays with the focus being how can we better serve and love one another? Some of that comes in the form of marriage relationships. Sometimes it's in the form of how we relate to our children, how we relate to others, but how can we better love and serve one another? And an important component of that that we have tried to focus on as well is what do we do to help people who are in need? What do we do to help people who may be struggling, who may be in a ditch or need a tow, as Pastor Cole likes to say? And my hope is that as we go through this together, we'll get a glimpse of Jesus' love and the layers of Jesus' love in perhaps a way that we haven't thought of or spent as much time meditating on. So I guess my warning is, right, as we look at John 13, there'll be a temptation to be like, all right, yeah, I got that. Like I learned that in Sunday school when I was little. You know, Jesus washed some feet, right? But what we want to do is try to resist the urge to stay at that basic level and look again at the depth of Christ's love. So what I'm going to do is read the passage. The passage is a little bit lengthy. So what I would encourage you to do is as after we read the passage, if you want to look on your own while I'm preaching, so that you could have just better understanding. I won't be able to go through each verse as in depth as I would like to, but I at least want to read so that you can get the whole story. All right, starting in verse 1. Just before the Passover feast, Jesus knew that his time had come to depart from this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now loved them to the very end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, that he should betray Jesus. Because Jesus knew that the Father had handed all things over to him, and that he had come back from God and was going back to God. He got up from the meal, removed his outer clothes, took a towel, and tied it around himself. He poured water into the wash basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to dry them with a towel that he had wrapped around himself. Then he came to Simon Peter. Peter said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not understand what I am doing now, but you will understand after these things." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus replied, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus replied, "The one who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you disciples are clean, but not every one of you." For Jesus knew the one who was going to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not every one of you is clean." So when Jesus had washed their feet and put his outer clothing back on, he took his place at the table again and said to them, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and do so correctly, for that is what I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example. You should do just as I have done for you. I tell you the solemn truth. The slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one who is sent as a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you understand these things, you will be blessed if you do them." So, as we look at this passage, John chapter 13, I think that it's imperative that we get a little bit of the context for what's going on, right? So John's Gospel 1 through 12 is focusing on the signs of Jesus. And we get a transition here in chapter 13 where essentially the passion starts to become in focus, right? So when John starts off in verse 1, by talking about the Passover meal, this should clue us into a few things. First, the Passover centers around, maybe not obviously, but the Passover centers around ancient Israel and what happened in the Exodus. God's redeeming ancient Israel, delivering them out of Egypt, blood being significant in literally the Israelites being passed over and then brought out of Egypt. The Passover in John is a prominent theme. John loves to connect Jesus to the Passover lamb. This is evident in chapter 1 of John, where John the Baptist calls Jesus, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world." It's evident elsewhere in John as you get further into the Passion, where John is constantly making connections, showing us detail by detail that Jesus is the Passover lamb. So when we come to chapter 13, we realize that Jesus is literally having his last meal, his last supper with his disciples, before everything that he knows is coming is about to happen. And I think that if it's worth delving into this a little bit, because it gives, in my opinion, a really more full understanding of what Jesus does here in chapter 13. So Jesus knows that his time has come. John loves to record Jesus' words using hour and time. It's a prominent theme throughout the gospel. For instance, in chapter 2, Jesus, talking to his mother at the wedding of Cana, refers that his hour has not yet come. Chapter 7, Jesus going up to the Feast of Tabernacles talks about time. His hour, it's a prominent theme, right? So now we're getting to the kind of the climax of the story, right? His hour, his time has come, right? Meaning that everything that he was on earth for has been building up into these next scenes. What's fascinating to me about this is that the idea that Jesus is with his disciples, who he's literally poured into for the past 3 years, that he spent time teaching them, that he's spent time being patient with them, that he has interacted with them at so many different levels, and then he's having this last meal with them, yet he knows everything that's about to happen. He knows that he's about to get deserted by his disciples. He knows that he's going to get betrayed by one of his disciples. He knows that he's going to have false accusations brought against him, false witnesses brought against him, that he's going to endure multiple trials, and then he's going to endure literally the cross. He's going to bear the sin of the world. He knows all of that is coming, and yet he takes time in this meal to do something that's seemingly strange, right? In other words, he has all of this mounting pressure that could be rising in his mind, yet he takes time to love his disciples. So as we go through the story, hopefully some of these ideas will be prominent to you. Jesus has recently entered Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. I was super excited. Like Mary and I didn't really talk much before, but like the song that she sang, the words of life, fit right in with this because Peter in John 6 says that Jesus has the words of life. Then later in the song, quotes from Isaiah 6, which John chapter 12 has. So Jesus comes into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. Some people believe, some people don't believe, and then we get to chapter 13. So, what's going on in this upper room? Well, most of you guys in here are probably like me. When you think about the Last Supper, you think about the synoptics, right? You think about Matthew, Mark, Luke, you think about the upper room, you think about Jesus telling 2 of his disciples to go on ahead of them, where they'll find a man who's already prepared a room for them. Most of us are aware that in this upper room, it's a large upper room, it's furnished, and it's ready. It's already prepared. And most of us have some idea of the actual teaching of the Lord's Supper, where Jesus is offering his body as the bread, his blood as the wine. But this story that we just read through is only recorded in John, right? So when you put all of them together, you have an idea of what's going on at the Lord's Supper. You remember perhaps the taking of the bread, the taking of the wine. You remember perhaps on the negative side, the disciples coming in Luke and fighting about who's the greatest. Some interesting things. And then you pair it with what happens here in John. So, Jesus is at a table. He's reclining at it with his disciples. Something interesting about this passage is that most of the time in the ancient Middle East, when you were going to go in and eat together, someone would wash your feet, or you would wash your own feet. But apparently, in this setting, in the upper room, there was no one who was available to wash feet. They had privacy, they were by their own, the upper room was prepared, but no one was there to do that menial task. And they didn't do that menial task for themselves. So it's something that is a little bit of it's just an interesting example that, or something that normally wouldn't happen, right? Normally, everyone would wash their feet before they sat down for the meal. So let's consider for a moment how, in light of all of that, right, this setting of this last meal, Jesus decides to do this particular action as kind of like his last action that foreshadows his final action, his death and resurrection. Like, why does he choose this as his last teaching example? Like, he speaks after this. He has more words that he says. But one of his last actions to his disciples is literally washing their feet. What's that about? All right, so we're told in the passage that Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, now he loves them to the very end, or to the full extent. And right after that is when he decides to wash their feet. So this must be important. So a couple things about washing feet that I want to mention. I don't want to focus on like the Middle Eastern custom of washing feet too much, because I feel like a lot of you probably have some awareness of that. And for perhaps a lot of you out there, it maybe makes you feel uncomfortable, like it makes me feel uncomfortable. For instance, right before church started, one of the little children was running around with their sandals like on their hands. It was kind of freaking me out. It was one of my children though. So anyways, but yeah, like this idea of foot washing is pretty foreign to you and I. But I did a little bit of research because I'm a nerd like that. I found this guy who's a Middle Eastern scholar who I've really enjoyed reading, and he talks at fair length about foot washing. And these are some of the things that he talked about that I thought might, be beneficial for all of us to hear. So, apparently in the Middle East, the idea of feet are it's almost like a four-letter word for some people in the Middle East. It's just, there's something that are dirty, there's something that are not, it's not socially acceptable to talk about them. And we see elements of this in the Old Testament. For instance, when Abraham is visited by the three angelic men, he offers them water so they can wash their feet, but he doesn't wash their feet. There are other passages that I thought were pretty interesting regarding this idea of throwing sandals. For instance, in Psalm 60 and in Psalm 108, in regards to Edom, we throw our sandals, which apparently, again, is a very social, what in the world, it's a way to show someone that you essentially despise them. And apparently this is something that still happens in the Middle East, which is a little bit surprising to me. I didn't realize this because I guess maybe I'm too young. But apparently one of the President Bushes had a shoe thrown at him on a Middle Eastern trip. And that was like a really big deal. Or when Saddam Hussein's statue was toppled over, people started hitting it with their shoes. All of this to say that feet are something that in that culture it was something that it was something you didn't talk about, and it was something that was deemed like the lowest task to have to wash someone's feet. In fact, some of the rabbis apparently of the time, and again, this is not from me, this is from my Middle Eastern source, but he said that it would be, you were not supposed to have a Jewish servant wash feet. You could have a Gentile servant wash feet, but not a Jewish servant, because it was seen as so demeaning. So all of that to get us to this idea of Jesus is loving his own, and he's now going to love them to the very end, and he decides to do this. So we're told that Jesus Sorry, I have to find where my spot was. It's a little embarrassing.
You can use my one if you want.
Yeah, you're right. So we get some really dramatic words that John used to describe Jesus getting up to wash the disciples' feet. He's very methodical in how he describes the setting, which I find to be helpful as somebody who likes to kind of paint a picture in my mind when reading, right? So John says this regarding Jesus. he got up from the meal. No words are spoken, right? We're just told that Jesus gets up. It's during the meal, which again is strange, as I mentioned earlier. He gets up. This would be a surprise to the people at the meal. He takes off his outer garment. He wraps a towel around his waist. He pours water into a basin, and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. Again, there's no words that are taking place. Like Jesus is just getting up and he's doing something. And the more I looked at the passage, the more I was struck by this, right? That Jesus, loving them to the end, the next thing that he does are actions, right? He just gets up and starts to do something, right? So slow and methodical. So there are two main people that the passage focuses on that I think are relevant for you and I to think about, right? The first one is Judas, and the second one being Peter. Now, I think personally that looking at Judas and Peter helps us to understand the layers or the depth of Jesus' love in this story. For instance, as most of us know, right, Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. In John's gospel, actually, right after Peter says, "You have the words of life," in John chapter 6, later on in that passage, we get like Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. In fact, he knows that Judas is going to betray him before he's even chosen as a disciple. So Judas, as the betrayer, Jesus has full knowledge of that. He's up in this upper room with them, sharing this meal. It said of Judas at one point that it would be better for him not to have been born. I like Matthew's rendition when Judas says, "Surely not I, Rabbi. Yes, it is you." In other words, Jesus knows that this guy who is among them is a traitor, is going to betray him. And yet Jesus is going to wash his feet. I think it's super profound that Jesus takes time to show love to somebody that he knows is about to betray him. We're told that the devil had already prompted Judas to betray Jesus in John 13:2. This means that as Jesus is literally taking the lowest form of service that he could give, that Judas just lets him wash his feet, all the while knowing that he's going to betray Jesus. It's crazy to me when you think about it. Judas has been with Jesus for 3 years. He's heard Jesus' teachings. He's seen the multitude of lives that have been changed because of Jesus. He's seen Jesus' power, his miracles. He's actually ministered along with the other disciples. And yet here, in the end, surrounded by his brothers, with literally the Son of God washing his feet, in his heart he knows that he's going to betray Jesus. Judas had the best teacher in the world and failed to learn. I think that part of the potential application for this type of passage is for us to do some self-evaluation regarding the people in the passage. I personally, as I was reading and studying this passage, thought about Judas. Thought about how Judas, to the average person, would have just seemed like he was right in step, right in line with everything Jesus was doing. There would be nothing per se about him that would make him stand out as someone who didn't believe or wasn't in step with Jesus. Yet all the while, even like everyone was surprised, right? No one knew who the one who betrayed Jesus was, except for Jesus. So it says that Satan enters Judas later on in the passage. And it says that in the end, which we didn't read through, it says that Judas takes the bread and leaves at night, which I love that detail that John gives us, because light and darkness is so prominent in John, so prominent in 1 John as well. It's interesting that Judas, in the end, leaves the light of the world and enters into darkness. So Judas, he serves, in my opinion, a really good function in this story, right? How crazy is Jesus' love for us? Enough that he's willing to wash the disgusting feet of the person who's about to betray him. I think another worthwhile focus is Peter, right? Good old Peter, he's always the first one seemingly to open his mouth and say something. right? So this like beautiful painting of a picture of Jesus getting up, Jesus pouring the water, Jesus moving to start washing the disciples' feet, and then breaks the silence. Peter, right? This is the same Peter that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus tells him that Satan has asked to sift him. Jesus tells Peter in Luke that when he turns back, strengthen the brothers. Peter says in Luke that he's ready to go to prison and die with Jesus, right? All of these things are interesting to me as you think about Peter's reaction here in John. Peter, I appreciate that his personality seemingly is consistent in the Gospels. I appreciate that he seems to be caught off guard with what Jesus is doing. Jesus is constantly surprising the disciples in the Gospels. Like, constantly like doing something and they just seem confused. They don't know what's going on. And good old Peter is going to be the first one to verbalize this. Presumably the rest of them are shocked at this as well. My Middle Eastern scholar friend, that I'm going to call him now, talking about foot washing, said that he did research and he couldn't find any single example of someone who was a teacher, a rabbi, who ever would wash feet. In fact, the rabbis would have people, the rabbi would go around teaching, and part of the responsibility was for his followers to observe and watch his life, specifically what he did on the Sabbath. And even them, as ones who would serve the rabbi, would never wash the rabbi's feet, unless the rabbi washed their feet. So it's natural that Peter would be caught off guard, and one of them would say something. And again, it's interesting that it is Peter. I find it fascinating that Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Indignant that he's not going to let Jesus wash my feet, right? He persists even. "Oh, you're never going to wash my feet," right? In other words, Jesus' offer to Peter of this costly demonstration of love, right? There's something that's so unthinkable, so disgusting in that society. He's going to refuse it, right? I'm going to refuse to accept your amazing demonstration of costly love until Jesus lets him know, hey, if you don't accept this, you have no part with me. You have no share with me. And then all of a sudden, Peter's mood changes, right? Don't just wash my feet, wash my whole body. The amazing transformation of Peter realizing, well, wait, I want to part with Jesus, right? And if having a part with Jesus means accepting this costly demonstration of love, then that's exactly what I need to do. And of course, all of this foreshadows, right, the more amazing costly demonstration of love that's going to happen next, right? Jesus' actual death on the cross, that costly demonstration of love that's unimaginable, right? That literally the God of the universe would enter humanity and die for sinful people. Peter accepting Jesus' costly demonstration of love in my opinion, foreshadows the next demonstration of costly love. So, I think that as we kind of move through the passage, right, talk a little bit about Judas, talk a little bit about Peter, give an overview of the passage, I want us to focus now on different ways in which Jesus' love here has great depth to it. The first aspect that I think that is worth considering is Jesus' great patience that is demonstrated in this story. He's been with his disciples for so long, right? For years, 3 years. Often they get it wrong. Often they don't understand. Often they seem to be acting foolish. I believe we have many times heard in this church that if you were to grade the disciples, they often would fail. Perhaps the majority of time would fail. But Jesus is patient with them. He's patient with them when they don't understand. And his last act before he's going to go out, speak a little more, and then be arrested, is to show them the sacrificial, servant-like love that demonstrates great patience. It's not just Judas, right? As he's washing Peter's feet, what would he maybe be thinking? Soon Peter is going to deny me. He's going to struggle. He's going to be weeping. But I know that he's going to turn back. What would he be thinking about the rest of them? Right? They're going to flee. They're going to abandon me. They're going to fall asleep when they're supposed to keep watch. But he's patient with them. Consider the humility of Jesus' love. This one to me is one of the easiest, right? Jesus, the Son of God, right, is going to do this menial task. I like how in the beginning of the passage, we're let in on the fact that Jesus knows who he is and where he's going. He knows that he belongs to the Father, that he's going to the Father. It has echoes of in my opinion, of Philippians 2, right? The fact that the Son of God is literally going to humble himself and enter the world for the purpose of dying. The Son of God literally is doing a disgusting menial task for his disciples. Why? Because he loves them. He wants to set an example for them. He wants to show them the depth of how they're supposed to love each other. I would also say we should consider the endurance of his love. He's patient with them. He never gives up on them. I mean, if I think about love in my own life, I don't want to love people that are hard to love. I want to give up on them. Why? Because it's easy. Jesus could have given up on his disciples so many different times, but he's patient. He endures. He endures even when they have no idea what's going on. He endures even when he knows they're going to flee, when he knows that they're going to deny him, when he knows that one's going to betray them. He still loves them. He still endures. I would say also that we should consider the kindness of Jesus' love. How kind is it to love and serve someone who's about to betray you? I mean, I think it's unthinkable for me. Like, I don't even want to be kind sometimes to the people I'm supposed to be kind to, mind less someone who's about to betray me. Showing kindness and love is difficult, especially when people are difficult. Yet Jesus shows kindness. He extends kindness in the way that he loves these disciples. I also think it's important to consider that Jesus is gentle in this gesture, but he's also firm when he needs to be, right? It's a tender example of showing love to the disciples to wash their feet. But he's also firm, right? He knows, he tells Peter, like, no, if you don't let me wash your feet, you have no part of me. Right? He's firm when he needs to be, even in this gentle, tender example of love. And of course, it's it shows so much selflessness to love in this way. I think this was one of the most convicting parts of the study for me. It's difficult to love people when you don't expect anything in return. It's difficult to love somebody if you're not getting anything back. It's difficult to love somebody when they're different from you. It's difficult to love somebody when they make you uncomfortable. It's difficult to love somebody when you fear them, when you don't know what to do. You get confused sometimes, I think. I do personally. Like, how do I show love to this person? How do I show love to this person who's different than me? And yet Jesus shows love through a simple action. So his love is selfless. One person put it this way: Jesus' love demonstrated in washing the disciples' feet brilliantly encompasses the fruit of the Spirit. Or to look at it a different way, when Paul talks about love in 1 Corinthians 13, Jesus exhibits pretty much every single aspect of that love in this selfless act of washing the disciples' feet. And I think that's important to consider when we move to how can we apply this passage to our life? What can we take away from it? Certainly not to literally wash each other's feet, at least in my opinion. If you think differently, it's okay. But certainly that's not the takeaway for me. But one of the things that I think is significant in considering how to apply this passage to our lives, right? First, and perhaps most importantly, Are we bathed? Are we clean? Right? Jesus tells Peter that he is clean. He only needs to wash his feet. Right? Those of us who have been bathed in the blood of the Lamb, right? Those of us who are in Christ, we are clean. We have been saved. But our work is not finished, right? We're in daily need of still having our feet washed, right? Seeking the forgiveness of sin, fighting against our sin nature. So for anyone in here who hasn't been cleaned, who hasn't been saved, right? Who does not believe that Jesus has done the work for them, that would be the first step today. I think another interesting thought to consider as we think of takeaways that's not on the screen is, do you find yourself ever feeling like Judas? Always around things that are seemingly good, right? Knowing the right answers, knowing how to interact with people, but your heart's not being changed. You're not growing in love in a way that exhibits gentleness, kindness, joy, sacrifice. If you find yourself like Judas, if you identify with Judas in the passage, perhaps today would be a good opportunity to start to figure out how your love can grow and look more like Jesus. I also think that when we think about application of this, are you ready to love with the depth of love that Jesus displayed? As I mentioned now a couple of times, the depth of love that Jesus displayed here is really difficult, and I think that's what's so amazing, yet so amazing to think about, but also makes you feel so inadequate, right? Most of us want to love the people around us who are easy to love, right? We want to love the people that we're comfortable with. We want to interact with the people that we can easily interact with. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone, right? People that are different from me can be harder for me to interact with. It stretches me, right? It makes me have to go outside of my comfort zone. And yet that's exactly what Jesus shows us. He shows us love that goes outside of our comfort zone. He shows us love that doesn't give up on people. He shows us love to people who consistently do wrong. People who consistently will disappoint us. He shows that persistent love for those people. People that are stubborn, people that are prone to failure, people that society has given up on, people that society has deemed unimportant. These are the people that we're called to love. And we're called to love and serve them in action, like Jesus did. As I was going through this study, one of the things that was really encouraging to me, actually, is to think about people in my life who have demonstrated the love that Jesus demonstrated in here, in this passage. And I couldn't think of a lot of people, but there are examples among us of people who love like Jesus loved. We have this body of believers has been blessed to interact with leaders who love the unlovable, right? Who never give up on somebody, who love with that relentless pursuing love like Jesus. So as we conclude, I would encourage you, as I've been encouraging myself in preparing for this message, to consider areas in your life where you're weak in your love. Are you weak in the way that you love those that annoy you? Are you weak in the way that you deny love for people that are stubborn, that God has placed in your life? God has placed every person that's in our life, in our path, there for a reason. And the reason is to extend the love of Christ. So as we end, I would just encourage you to take time today to think about how you can love more like Jesus. That layered love that is self-sacrificing, that will pursue, that won't give up, that will be kind, that will be gentle, how you can really imitate and love like Christ did. Let's pray. Dear God, I thank you so much for your love in Jesus. I thank you for his perfect example set for us, his example of undying, unyielding love, his death on the cross, forgiveness of sins that he offers. I thank you for daily washing us of our sins. I thank you that you give us opportunity each and every day to love the people around us. I pray that we would better love the people around us, that we would be humble in our approach to people, that we would love those that are forgotten in society, those that others don't care about, that we would show actual, genuine love of Christ in the way that we act and serve one another. I thank you for each person here. I pray that you would strengthen them in your love. I pray this in your name.